With the raptor incident, the guests of the zoo were definitely a bit shook up. Before this all escalated, many of you had given out some wonderful names for the raptor pack, and we have decided on the best ones. When all the raptors were back in their cage, they could finally be officially named. The alpha was very clearly to be named the big one. Many of you suggested this, so there's no doubt about it that the big one will be referenced to the one from the original Jurassic Park. Then Azriel had a wonderful suggestion of Jade for one of the raptors. Noah Roy was responsible for one of the raptors being named Voodoo. The name was very cool, and this particular raptor was very elusive, thereby making it the perfect name. Jurassic Gaming then had the cool suggestion of naming one of the raptors Viper. Rainbowsaurus Rex then came out with the name Slasher for the next raptor. Viper and Slasher were always seen together, and up to no good. Herrerasaur Studios then had the great idea of naming one of the raptors Emily. It was a cute name, which was a stark contrast to how deadly she was. Pirate Hunter had a great suggestion to name the most deadly raptor Riot. Riot was actually the one who mauled the activists responsible for the incident. Order 66 was to thank for the name Eclipse, a very cool name for one of the raptors as well. And lastly, Darian Love came up with the ideas of naming the raptors after the reindeers of Santa. But unfortunately, no Rudolph was named. So, in the end, the name Rudolph was chosen for the final raptor, the runt of the litter. The park got over the shock of the raptors rather quickly. Things would be settled in court regarding the sabotage by the activists, but to quickly distract the public from the carnage, the park announced their next dinosaurs. Now part of the plan too, to make the people forget the past dark days quickly, was to bring flying dinosaurs to the zoo. There had been an aviary zone before, but never before were there multiple species on display. This announcement had a lot more people hyped, but the park would still need time to make this happen, as a lot of room needed to be excavated, and the whole process of getting the flyers into the enclosure was a fairly new method. Thus first, the Nasutoceratops would make its entry in the park. These gentle, smaller herbivores were a great addition, especially after the death that had been dealt by the raptors. Some of the audience could really use some more gentle giants instead of carnivores, and despite their dangerous looking horns and spikes, the Nasutoceratops was one of the friendliest dinosaurs in the park. Though they used the horns for dueling and imposing on a potential mate, they often would travel and migrate in giant herds, making them easy to get along with other types of dinosaurs, but also not that stingy or abiding by a strict hierarchy within their own ranks. They were very docile, and it was mostly because of their tiny stature that they were like this. A Sinoceratops or Triceratops were kinda built like a tank and could easily fend off an enemy by themselves. For a Nasutoceratops, this was different, and they required on strength in numbers to fend off potential danger. Much like modern wildebeests, they would gather round and stand next to one another with their horns pointed outward to make a spiky and dangerous wall, almost comparable to that of a phalanx formation. Now despite these herbivores normally living in bigger herds, only a handful were flown over to the park. This was fine since they felt very safe and comfortable in this environment and had no reason to fear any danger. They all were in ear's reach, and their enclosure was actually put quite far from the other dinosaurs as well, meaning they could enjoy some peace and quiet. In this specific area of the park, the aviary enclosure would also be built, and since that would be designed as a dome, the sounds that all those flying types would make would not disturb them. In that sense, it was the perfect environment for these gentle plant eaters, who just went about their day like always. And thus it was finally time to create that earlier mentioned domed enclosure. This enclosure would be about 6 or 7 times as big as the previous one that was established in the zoo and would house 3 different types of flyers. First, there were the standard pteranodons, the dinosaurs that once had already steered through the skies in the previous park, but were nevertheless still very majestic. But besides the pteranodons would also be the Dimorphodon. These small creatures had been represented in the Jurassic World Zoo, which also found an untimely end. But here, they would live next to a new neighbor in the form of the Tropiognathus. This winged beast was the biggest of the 3 creatures present within this dome, and though it made somewhat of an intimidating and fierce first impression, they were able to live side by side with the other bird types. The place quickly became very crowded and wild with all the squeaking and flapping of wings. 7 Dimorphodons were added to the enclosure, and 6 of them needed to be named by the viewers, meaning you who are watching now. One of the 7 received the name Red 5 by the park itself, after the famed X-Wing pilot position from Star Wars. Let me know your thoughts of what would be good names for these Dimorphodons in the comments down below. Now, setting up the whole enclosure for these flyers was an interesting take. Since they would be spending most time in the air, there did not need to be a whole lot of plants, or even trees for that matter. They were, after all, besides the Dimorphodon, too big to settle on most trees. Much like coastal birds, they prefer to rest on rocks and also, by coincidence, on the lookout areas where guests could catch glimpses of these giant flying reptiles. Now, their diet consisted solely of fish, and so plenty of water was necessary. Normally they would fly down and swoop the fish out of the water, but there was not enough space for this within the enclosure. Instead, multiple feeders were placed where the birds could land and feed to their heart's content. It wasn't as spectacular, but it was still very satisfying to see all these animals crowded up and enjoying the feast of unending fish. Though there was somewhat of a hierarchy within the enclosure based on size of the creature, none of the 3 came in conflict with each other. It was very similar to how multiple species of bird could live at the coastal rocks in Africa, Ireland, or other places. The only thing that could get heated was when a bigger bird wanted to feed, and that was the same within this enclosure. If the Pteranodon or the Tropiognathus wanted to feed, and currently the Dimorphodon was there, then the little bugger would be shoved away by his bigger counterpart. The Dimorphodons themselves were a bit cowardly since they were so small and fragile, so it never ended up in conflict. They always chose to run, or in this case, fly away, and come back later for scraps. These flying types were a huge success. The viewing platforms gave a terrific sight over the entire area, and there was always something happening. None of the creatures were obscured by forests or dense vegetation. And the fact that they would rest on top of the viewing platforms gave the audience an even closer view of the busy bees. Now, the aviary was a huge success, and usually it meant that after such a 5-star attraction, that the park would take some force off the gas pedal to slowly introduce another attraction while still enjoying the audience buzz from the previous highlight. And so for the next dinosaur to be added was the Dilophosaurus. This meat eater would be a great addition as a carnivore without stirring too much panic after the raptor incident. The audience was all too familiar with these animals, so there was not as much attention, but it meant that people could slowly get accustomed again to the meat eaters in the park. In a way, the Dilophosaurus had some things in common with the raptors. It might be because of some of the new behavioral patterns applied by the scientists, but these Dilophosaurus were much more dependent on their group dynamic as they traveled in a pack. The first zoo housed only one Dilophosaurus, and they were also built to hunt alone with the help of their acid-like spit ability. They could not hunt very large prey, but could attack animals that were bigger than they were and blind them, and then take them out with smaller bites later. If you were unlucky, it was very possible that the Dilophosaurus started eating you while you were still alive. Though it had the ability to blind you, it lacked the ability to kill you in one single snap. Now these Dilophosaurus seemed very comfortable within a pack of 4 or 5, and there had even been reports of them thriving like this in previous parks. They would often still hide within the dense forests since they were so fragile, and would ambush their prey rather than hunt them down like raptors did. Now despite feeling comfortable within a pack, there was no hierarchy present. Often the food that was eaten was paired with a lot of loud screeching and frill showing as things heated up at the feeder. It was interesting too how these creatures prefer to get their food already cut up rather than live bait. And even though they prefer to stay within the forest in general, these Dilophosaurus felt very comfortable around the water due to the tall grass. It was very possible that they preferred the water too, as it was also quite warm, seeing as it was so near the hot spring area for the mixed herbivore enclosure. The steam from that enclosure would also often roll over to here to assure that the dinosaurs would stay warm during those cold, snowy days.